as, a graduate student, postdoc, there's this expectation that we just kind of have to accept things as they are. And, certainly in some cases, yes, that's true. But I think in a lot of cases, there are always things that are negotiable and that are malleable. And that I think a lot of that comes down to recognizing how valuable you are, not just as a person, but also as the work and your contribution.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Roberts. This is Season 7, Episode 2, and today my guest is Dr. Fushcia Hoover, a postdoc at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. Fushcia grew up in a low-income family and graduated from college into the depths of the Great Recession. Those experiences imparted her with certain financial attitudes and skills that influenced her financial journey through her PhD and postdocs. On the positive side, she already knew how to keep her expenses low, and she had enough discretionary income from her stipend to pay off her undergrad student loans. On the negative side, she was unfamiliar with investing and understandably gun-shy after witnessing the stock market crash. Fushcia and I discuss how her financial attitudes and practices evolved during her PhD and first postdoc, and why and how she negotiated her salary for her second postdoc position. You absolutely do not want to miss her concluding words of encouragement for all PhDs, but especially those in marginalized groups. By the way, we recorded this interview in October 2019. Without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Fushcia Hoover. I have joining me on the podcast today, Dr. Fushcia Hoover, and she's going to be talking to us about her background, kind of coming from a low-income family and ultimately entering graduate school and a couple different postdocs, and what she has picked up and learned about finances along the way and the work she's done on her own mindset. So I'm really excited about this episode. Fushcia, thank you so much for joining me. And will you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here. So I am a engineering by training. My graduate degrees are all from Purdue University's Ag and Bioengineering, but I was actually got my degrees from an interdisciplinary program, the Ecological Sciences and Engineering program at Purdue. And so a lot of my kind of research that I do now, as well as my dissertation work, looks at both social and ecological aspects of stormwater management and the way that green spaces and green infrastructure can be used to reduce runoff during rainfall events. But then what are the different environmental justice potential impacts? And then recently I've also started incorporating Black geography theory, which looks a bit more at kind of the way that people in place are connected and the historical and cultural connections between those two, and what that means in terms of stormwater management planning and where we place green spaces and green infrastructure. And so that's kind of where I'm at now. So I like to call myself, well, it always changes, but currently I call myself a socio-ecological systems hydrologist. So
It's so fascinating that the arc of your work, I guess, has gone in that direction from like the from the technological to the more sociological. Okay, great. And so you said you have your all degrees from Purdue, bachelor's through PhD. Is that right?
No, my bachelor's is actually from the University of St. Thomas, which is based in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I originally am from and grew up. And that degree was mechanical engineering as my bachelor's, and then I also had a minor in Middle Eastern studies. So I've always been interested in kind of, balancing my science and the technical work that I do with more social and cultural components. But yes, so that's where I started. And I've just been traveling the Midwest since, but now I'm on the East Coast.
Yeah, so tell us about your positions you've had since you finished your PhD.
Yeah, so I finished in 2017. So my first postdoc was through the National Academy of Sciences, and that's called National Research Council Graduate Fellowship or Postgraduate Fellowship, I believe. And so that was based at the Environmental Protection Agency in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I was there for a year and 8 months, almost 2 years. And then my contract for that ended. And my boss and I weren't sure if there was going to be additional funding. So I'd been applying to other postdocs, one of which is the one I'm currently in, which is with this is very long, so bear with me, the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, or SISINC for short. And that's in Annapolis, Maryland. So both very research focused. All I do is research. At the time, I wasn't interested in going into academia. So things have changed since. But yeah, and then I work in this position with Sarah Moreau, who is faculty at Arizona State University.
Gotcha. So interesting that you just dropped in there that you're now more interested in academia than you were before. People don't usually go in that direction, but not the subject of our interview today. How to follow up about that another time. So let's take a step back even further to your childhood and then basically your time going through college and up until you entered graduate school. Just really briefly, what was your financial experience during that time?
Yeah, so my mom is a single parent, and I have a twin sister as well. So it was the two of us and our mom. So we grew up in a single parent household, and then we have been low income for the duration of my childhood into like early adulthood. And so, certainly for anyone that is from, I think, either one of those demographics, there was a lot of like coupons and buying things either on sale or clearance or discount, kind of on and off throughout growing up. We would have access to food stamps kind of depending on what my mom's like specific financial situation was at the time. And then, the great thing about growing up in Minnesota was that there were and are amazing social services. So, in terms of basic needs like healthcare, we were on free and the reduced lunch program. Like we always had all those things. And so it actually took me a very long time to realize that we were low income because of that. It was, I think, until 7th grade when I realized that lunch wasn't free. I just, thought that was a service everybody got. And people who brought their lunch, that was just a preference. So that, really grew up in that environment of, saving and being very conscious about spending. And my mom was also very open with us in terms of, explaining why we could only get things on sale. But I think the child part of me was still like, well, if she wanted to, we could get this, but she's just being a mom. Parents are mean type of childhood mentality. And then it wasn't until I got older that I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for telling us about that. And then when you got to college, what was the situation then? Like, you mentioned the school that you went to, but was it private or public, and how did you fund it?
Yeah, so it's the largest private university in the state of Minnesota, and I was fortunate. There was a college access program that I was a part of in high school called College Possible, and I made my sister join as well. So we were both part of the program, and it helped teach us about like scholarships, applying for college, doing college visits, as well as like practicing the ACT, which is what most of the Midwest takes as the college entrance exam. And so I try to remember, I think I had applied to between 20 and 30 scholarships as a senior. And then the ones that I was awarded combined with, I received a full tuition scholarship from the University of St. Thomas based on my academic record, and I'd done a lot of community service as a high school student as well. And so through that, I was actually receiving refund checks, which is pretty rare, because, a big part of the conversation my mom had with us in terms of college was that she could not afford to send us to college, and she could not afford to, co-sign on a loan. And so my sister and I were very diligent about then seeking out money and applying for scholarships and finding resources that could help us pay our way, or in my case, get paid through college. And so I think I took out 2 loans, one for my last semester of college, and then for a January term study abroad. So when I finished, I had about $7,000 in debt, and that was all within Sallie Mae at the time. So one was subsidized and one was unsubsidized.
That is really good. I mean, to have access to that program, first of all, maybe that was part and parcel with the general great services you had access to in Minnesota. But yeah, that set you up amazingly. And to, of course, then put in the work and get the scores and do the scholarships and everything that, I mean, it's clear why that happened and why you ended up in that position. So your tuition, you had a scholarship. You had enough scholarships coming in to cover the room and board and so forth, so that you were actually receiving at sometimes a little bit of money back. And then you took out some small student loans for part of that experience. So coming out of college, about $7,000 worth of student loans. And you didn't go immediately to graduate school. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And I actually forgot, I did have, I think it was maybe like a $3,000 loan from Wells Fargo, which maybe I can save this for the end as one of my pieces of advice. But, at the time I didn't know about kind of self loans or just the loan system. And my checking and savings was through Wells Fargo. And so that's who I was like, okay, not knowing that, that doesn't allow you to defer your loan and that the rates are higher. So when I graduated in 2009, which, if you remember, was kind of the peak of the financial crisis.
Yeah, the worst year to be graduating.
Yes, it was a horrible year to graduate. I didn't have a job. I had started working part-time for a program that I was a part of while at St. Thomas. And then I had transitioned into working for a program called AVID, or the Advancement via Individual Determination, which was located in the it's a national program, but I specifically worked within the St. Paul public school system. And that was part-time as well. So I was doing that. I had moved back home. I was living with my mom and barely able to pay my $50 a month minimum for my Wells Fargo loan. I had been able to put it into forbearance for 6 months. That was the only thing that they would allow me to do. So it was actually I was very stressed. Thankfully, living with my mom helped cut down on a lot of expenses. But yes, it was a lot of, penny pinching, and I think my income was maybe $500 a month before taxes. So, trying to give my mom something and then basically pay for my cell phone and basic expenses, and then this loan. So that was my financial situation upon graduating.
And did the difficulty in finding work of that year, the peak year, did that play in your decision to go to graduate school, or had that always been the plan?
So I'd always wanted to go to graduate school. I did not want to go right away. I was really mentally and emotionally exhausted after undergrad.
I know that feeling.
Yes. And I think a lot of us have those feelings even after grad school as well. And so I think the only difference was that I went to grad school sooner than if I would have had a full-time job. So I worked part-time for almost 2 years before going back to grad school. Because I also wanted to make sure that I wanted to go back, and I didn't know what I wanted to go back for quite yet. I knew I wanted to stay within engineering, but I knew a lot of what I didn't want to do. And so I took that time to figure out the programs and the schools of interest and what my potential research interests could be.
Gotcha. And so when you entered graduate school, Was that actually an increase in your income from working? I guess it's still part-time technically in graduate school, but was your income higher than at that point?
It was. It's funny, a lot of people talk about how poor graduate students are and how we're underpaid. And we are. I certainly agree that for the work that we're doing, all graduate students should be paid more. But it was such a jump in income for me. I think especially going into an engineering program at Purdue, I'm trying to think, I think my monthly income was about $2,500 per month. And so, all of a sudden, not only did I have a higher income, but I also had a dependable income. And it was an income that I was going to be getting regardless of like my hours that I put in. And so that was the first time, kind of being on a salary and having something that I was like, okay, wow, like I can pay my bills, I can pay my loans, and that's not something that I'm going to have to worry about. Where's this money going to come from? Am I going to meet my minimum payment this month? So it was a big relief for me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I would imagine, I mean, that stipend goes pretty far in Lafayette, Indiana, does it
Oh,
not?
yes, it does. And I very much, I had 2 roommates, so I didn't have a car either. I had a bicycle, so I was pretty much biking, or Lafayette, West Lafayette, if you're a student, or basically if you are affiliated with Purdue and you have a Purdue ID, then you get to take the public transportation system for free. So I wasn't having to spend money there. So it was really just, groceries and utilities and rent split between 3 people. So I found a lot of ways to reduce the amount of expenses that I had, because then I had also then started sending money back to my mom. So I was sending her about $300 every month. So definitely trying to, funnel resources and reduce costs.
Yeah, so it sounds like you took a lot of the strategies that you'd been using, prior to that point, and also some of the mindsets you'd had to that point. That was what you applied right then. You found the low cost, living situation. You use the public transit instead of owning a car, so you really reduced your expenses right off. But it sounds like still, even with sending your mom money, you probably had a good bit of discretionary money to be working with, right, above the bills that needed to be paid. So what did you start doing in your personal finances at that point? What did you have to learn about since you now finally have this discretionary money to do what you want with? What did you learn about? What did you apply in your life?
Yeah. So, it's funny. I had taken a financial literacy workshop before I started graduate school. And that was kind of more focused on like budgeting and saving and kind of negotiating, whether you pay off credit card debt first or if you have student loans, and kind of how you prioritize your debts. And so the biggest thing, aside from sending money home to my mom, was that I started making monthly loan payments on the undergraduate loans that I had. So I targeted the Wells Fargo private loan first. And then
So I just have a follow-up about that. So were those loans, at least maybe the federal ones, in deferment at that point?
They were, yes.
And what about the Wells Fargo one? Was that in deferment?
No, the Wells Fargo, my forbearance had ended after the first 6 months from me finishing my undergrad degree. And so I had, only been making $50 a month payments. So you can imagine on like a $3,000 loan, that's not very much. So I kicked that up. And I think I started making either between 150 and 200 loan payments every month. Yeah, so about, $500 every month was going to like this one particular loan, and then my mom. And then the rest that was remaining after bills and rent, then I was just putting into savings or using for, other expenses like going out to eat or going home for the holidays, things like that.
What I like to call irregular expenses.
Yes, irregular expenses.
Yes, the ones that can really mess up your cash flow if you try to pay for them in just one month.
Yeah.
So how long did it take you then? Did you just keep working and paying down those loans straight before adding any other goals to the picture? And how long did it take you to pay them off?
I did, yeah. So I had paid off my Wells Fargo loan by the end of my master's, so just under 2 years. And then my government loans, it took about 2.5. I don't remember if it was 2.5 or 3 years. I mean, so I think part of the decision why, even though those loans were in deferment, one of them, was unsubsidized. It was gaining interest. And I think because of coming from low income background, and even though I was in this position where I had a steady paycheck, I was still really worried that it would end. And certainly, I knew the degree would end, and I wasn't sure what my income would look like after that. And I didn't want to have that stress. And so I think I might have been the only one I knew of my friends with loans from undergrad who was actively paying it down. And that was my goal, was to have zero debt by the time I graduated from Purdue. And so, so pretty much all of the focus was on paying off those loans. And then I would typically have anywhere from like $200 to $400 that I would just put into savings every month.
Yeah, I will say in my contact with graduate students, it's some people do, but it's on the rare side to be working on paying down student loans while in graduate school. I think yours, because they're relatively small, I think some people get really defeatist about student loans, right? Especially if you have more than $100,000 or, multiple tens of thousands of dollars of student loans, it can feel really, really daunting. And like, why even bother like getting started on, your low salary during graduate school? But I think yours, they were just like, they were a fraction of what you made in a given year. And so it sort of felt like something that you could tackle probably. And like you were saying, you had that kind of fear of, well, what if, your program ends for whatever reason? Well, then the loans are coming out of deferment. You have to make at least minimum payments. And then what's your income going to be? You don't know. So that decision definitely makes sense to me. Hey, social distancers, Emily here. I hope you're doing okay. It took a few weeks, but I think I have my bearings about me in my new normal. There is a lot of uncertainty and fear right now about our public and personal health and our economy. I would like to help you feel more secure in your personal finances and plan and prepare for whatever financial future may come. You can schedule a free 15-minute call with me at pfforphds.com/coaching to determine if financial coaching with me is right for you at this time. I hope you will reach out, if only to speak with someone new for a few minutes. Take care. Now back to our interview. Did you do anything else within your personal finances during graduate school aside from, paying off those loans and then also building up savings?
No. So, I had conversation, like I talked with a couple of friends who were working, right, about IRAs and kind of investments, but it was all very intimidating. And I think for me at the time, it was easier to just put my money in savings, and then I could also see it, and there wasn't like a fear of losing it. With investment, I think particularly because of, coming out, like being an adult through the stock market crash, and also remembering like when Enron went under and people's entire pensions were lost. I have I wouldn't say a strong distrust, but I would say I'm very kind of apathetic and very weary of different financial institutions, right? And like even Sallie Mae and Freddie Mac and all of those. And so, for me, it's like, nope, like I want to have my money with me. So I'm putting it in my savings account. And by then I had also transferred to a credit union. And so I felt a lot more secure about credit unions as financial institutions, and that, I'm an owner in this. And I have amplified checking. So then I was getting, I don't remember what the return is, but it's a couple percent return, right? So then I was like, okay, I like this. I can make money from my own money And so even though, you know, I had those conversations with a lot of friends who had higher income backgrounds or whose families did, and so these were like conversations that they had, it still wasn't something I felt comfortable really digging into, because I think a part of me still felt like I didn't have the financial security yet to start investing.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I graduated from college in 2007, so 2 years before you did. So before the
Okay.
crisis hit, and I was safely in graduate school by the time everything went down. But I took away like a different kind of financial trauma from that whole period, which is that I'm very gun shy about the housing market. Like I've still always been a renter. I've yet to buy my first home. And that's partially because, you know, while I didn't personally experience, you know, all the media coverage is about people losing their homes and, you know, like foreclosures. So while I was very gung-ho about getting into the stock market, and I was able to experience the rise right after the crash, it still is something that lingers with me regarding the housing market. So it's just interesting to, talk to someone near a similar age who had some, you know, witnessing and some stake in everything that happened and what's been lingering. So actually, maybe you've turned this around since then. You were talking about, you know, during graduate school, you were nervous to start investing. And I think it actually is really smart to build up the cash savings to get the debt paid off before embarking on that. So at what point did you or have you started to invest?
Yeah, so I started once a few months, maybe 6 months into my first postdoc. So by that point, by the time I finished at Purdue, I had about a 4-month break where I was kind of job searching and then preparing for a move. And I had saved up about maybe $5,000 to $6,000 in savings. One of the things that I did start doing was also using credit cards as a way to kind of prepare for high cost expenses. So I had opened a card just before I graduated, so that it allowed me to have, you know, 18 months, like 0% APR, because I knew, okay, I'm not going to have a job. I had a part-time job that I got to cover basic things, but in terms of, you know, I have to move, that card held all of those expenses. And then once I started my postdoc and getting paid, then I worked on paying that down. And, you know, since I had 18 months, there was no rush. But then because I was like, okay, I have a job as an engineer coming in for an NRC, my salary was, or my stipend, it was $69,000 for the year, which certainly is very high compared to a lot of postdocs. But I think most of the federal agencies, you're going to see a higher salary that's closer to what a full-time federal employee would be making.
And for you in particular, that's over double, right? What you had been making during graduate school.
Yes. Well, and I should say that my first year of my master's, I applied for and was awarded National Science Foundation, GRFP.
Fantastic.
So I think that also really allowed me to focus on my debt, because then I was making, you know, $30K. Still had to account for the taxes, which was not fun, but compared to my friends in, you know, College of Liberal Arts or in English or, you know, social science, making $13K, like that's a big difference. So one of the things that I actually learned from you was while I was in my first postdoc, I joined the National Postdoc Association, and you were a guest. This would have been a couple years now. And so I watched your webinar when you gave a presentation. And so then from that point, I looked more into kind of the difference between, you know, an IRA and a independent like tax account, and figuring out, okay, you know, with NRC, it's the same thing. They don't take out taxes. And so then
I'll just jump in there and say, because you were on fellowship, like because you were not technically an employee, I'm just explaining for the listener. So you wouldn't have had access to, you know, the the workplace-based retirement account, whatever that would be that they would offer to their full-time employees. So you're still dealing with, kind of a stipend. You still have to handle the taxes manually, and your really only tax advantage retirement option would be an IRA, right? Nothing was being offered through your employer because you didn't
Yes.
have an employer.
Yes. Yeah. I was contracted and a contractor. So yeah, I did a little bit of, I should say I did a lot of research trying to figure out then where I wanted to open an account. And so I actually ended up going with an online system called Betterment because I did not have the time to actually look into managing my own investments. And, I think because so much stuff is online, it also made it easy for me. So then I didn't have to find an office location to go into. And then in my postdoc now, we are considered faculty of the University of Maryland, and the University of Maryland is a state-run system. And so we actually have mandatory investment portfolios, and the portfolio that I chose is through I don't remember the full meaning, but it's TIAA.
Yeah, I don't know what it stands for either, but it's TIAA or TIAA CRAF, yeah.
Yeah. So I still have my Betterment accounts, and I haven't decided how much I'll be putting into it. They take out just over 7% from my salary for the TIA account. So I need to figure out what that balance is going to look like. But yeah, now I was like, okay, it's probably about time. I was a little bit nervous about being, older, 31 and just starting to invest. But I think because I don't have any debts and because, I have a little bit of credit card debt, but I also just moved for this postdoc. So, I think that's why I was finally at a point where I feel confident that I will have a job and I will continue to have income, and that's not going to be something I'll be lacking anymore. And so now I can fully invest, having confidence still, the system is still problematic, but I at least have confidence that, I'm not going to wake up and be without a job. So.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so you said, earlier there were maybe some things that you brought out of your childhood that you had an aversion towards debt, smart one.
Mm-hmm.
But you also maybe weren't exposed to conversations around investing and IRAs, maybe like some of your peers were. Was there anything else that you kind of felt maybe you were a little bit out of step with other people during graduate school or during your postdocs regarding personal finance? And anything else you had to learn or mindsets to change or overcome?
So I think I definitely learned about the way, the healthy ways that you can use credit cards to manage certain debts. I think that came from conversations with a close friend when I moved for my postdoc. I opened a card to buffer that. And a lot of that helped in kind of realizing that all debt doesn't have to be bad, that, it can help you create a credit score and debt management techniques and strategies, and kind of build out this financial portfolio that can actually then make you have a higher score and more competitive for other loans and things like that. And so a lot of that came from conversations with friends who, had either taught themselves that or they learned it by proxy from their parents. And just asking about their debt and kind of how they managed it. And then also asking, are you afraid that you won't pay it off, or are you afraid that it's going to be there forever? And certainly, I remember ex of mine, she was like, yeah, I mean, it's just going to be there, and it's just this thing that I have, and I'll make payments, and, it sucks, but also I have the education that I wanted to get, and like I'm in the job that I want. And so, I think through those conversations, it definitely helped release some of the anxiety and like intense fear around debt. And then, listening to webinars or reading your blog, for example, and just trying to educate myself more so that I'm more informed. And that's definitely alleviated a lot of the kind of fear and anxiety. But I think, I still like coupons. I still like things on sale. It's still really hard for me to pay full price for clothing or, like a pair of shoes that's $100. I'm like, can't do that. And, like you, I've been a renter this whole time, and I don't know if I want to buy property or a home. I did buy a car when I moved to Cincinnati, and so I'm making those monthly payments now. And so, part of it is also, okay, well, I'm going to make these payments and pay off my car, and then maybe see where I'm at in terms of if I'm, in a permanent position, that then I feel more comfortable buying a home. I think some of the approach that I still have to managing debt is to have like one type of debt at a time, take on debt, pay it off, then take on a new debt, pay it off.
Yeah, so it sounds like you really have learned much more about, as you were kind of saying earlier, debt management, or how you can use debt as a tool, especially to avoid large expenditures of cash, right? So, because it sounds like you still have cash savings to a degree, but it's more about not wanting to let go of that and using debt to help you basically just to hold both, to have the cash and to have the debt, so that you can feel more secure around it. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of kind of summing that up.
Yeah, and then the other thing that you mentioned that you wanted to talk about in this interview was negotiating your salary, which is also kind of another, I guess, sort of mindset leap, right? Like not only maybe from someone coming from the kind of background that you have, but also just being in academia where like with your first postdoc, negotiation is not really an option, but it sounds like you did at your first opportunity negotiate. So can you tell us how that worked?
Yeah. And, to be honest, a lot of it was just like, I need to practice this because I know I'll have to do it at some point. So let me just practice it now because it's lower stakes.
Yeah, good point.
So part of that came from in your webinar, you had been talking about kind of how you plan for transitions. So either going from your degree to a postdoc to a full-time permanent position, and managing the moving costs and change in expenses. And so I had sat down and looked at essentially the cost of living for Annapolis and estimating, what my costs are now and what's expected to grow. The majority of that, it's about a 300% increase in housing expenses from Cincinnati to Annapolis. And so I started there and then looked at, how much would I want in savings or investments, and then worked with the business office at Succinct to then figure out, is there a parking cost? Learning about the exact percentage rate that they take out for retirement or investments, like trying to find what are all the other hidden costs and expenses that come with this position so that I could factor that into my budget and then know what would my minimum salary need to be. Because, I know my minimum payments for my car, I know my cell phone payments, like those are things that I know. And then wanting to make sure that I had wiggle room. And so then I think on top of that, I also wanted to try and stay as close as possible to what I was already making. Certainly, it can be challenging to do that with a different type of postdoc, particularly because this one's affiliated with the University of Maryland. Academic postdocs are much lower. But I didn't want to, have this like 20,000 drop. Because the other great thing about the NRC was that they gave a 1,500 increase every year. So, I came in at 69, but then the next year I was making 70.5. And so it's like, okay, well, how close can we get to this? And so again, a lot of it was using my network, and talking to, in particular, a good friend who is now at Cornell. She had just finished her PhD. And so she had negotiated her position. And so, asking her for advice and resources and kind of how you frame what you're negotiating for and the language that you use so that it's still appropriate and respectful, but that you're still firm in terms of, these are my skills, particularly because I was coming out of a postdoc. I already have almost 2 years of experience post PhD, and I'll have all these other publications and knowing different questions to ask. And so that's really, I wrote up this letter, had a few people review it. Ironically, when I asked my former PhD advisor, she was like, we don't do that. If someone were to go, like, maybe I'd give like a 2,000 to 3,000 increase. But, when I had looked up other negotiation strategies on like Inside Higher Ed, I used a lot of their articles. They mentioned, I think it's like 15 to 22% is typically what you negotiate as your range, particularly if it's, if it's not a lateral position, if you're moving up. So it's like, okay, we're going to go for 15%. And they did not give it to me, but they came close. So, from there I went back and said, okay, based on this salary, like, could I make it work? And I could, and it's going to be tight, which is a bit frustrating to have a point where, you have more flexibility and you have more expendable income. And now it feels a little bit more like, kind of being a grad student again, where it's, okay, smaller salary, I have to be more conscious of where my money is going and not spending as much as I was, particularly now that I have a car and all the expenses that are associated with that. But I know that I have the skills to make it work. And at this point, I'm also looking for a permanent position after this postdoc. And so, I don't anticipate after this 2-year position being in a situation where I have to kind of penny pinch and reduce costs elsewhere.
Yeah, it sounds like you approach that. I mean, it's clear that you did a lot of research and preparation through that process, not only taking what you learned from the webinar that I gave, but also, this research you did for the articles in Inside Higher Ed and speaking with, your friend, and you really prepared for that in kind of the best way possible. So it's a great model for the listeners to hear, I think, especially because you knew that you were going into an almost, guaranteed income drop and also a cost of living increase. Like both of those factors. Yeah, the need for being really careful around this. And, if your academic advisor said, well, this isn't done, I mean, it is done sometimes in some places, maybe no one's ever attempted it with her, but I want to point the listeners to one of my resources, which is postdocsalaries.com. And there's also another one, PhDstipends.com, for those in graduate school. And so it's kind of like a Glassdoor, but like for those types of positions, for postdocs and for grad student positions. And so that's just another resource out there if people want to get kind of benchmarks on what is reasonable to be paid for different kinds of postdocs in different areas of the country. And I also asked questions about negotiation on that survey. So I think the last time I looked in the database, it was around 25% or maybe a third of the people who had answered the questions had said, yes, I at least attempted to negotiate salary or benefits for the postdoc position. So I think it's becoming more and more popular as people realize that this is a standard thing you do in most jobs, and why don't we at least try it in these academic or non-academic postdocs. So that was a great story.
True. Well, and I think too, salary, while I think it is very important, isn't the only thing that you can negotiate. Like, you can negotiate moving expenses and you can negotiate time off. I also negotiated my start time because I wanted to finish through my contract at the EPA before coming to Succinct. So, that was something that I successfully negotiated. And so I kind of had picked my top 3 things of like, well, these are the things that I would like. So we'll see where they can meet me. But so there's another postdoc who negotiated because he also was coming out of a previous postdoc. And then everyone else who we've talked to, didn't go, like I remember we were having a conversation. They were like, I didn't know that you could do that. Like, that's a thing. And we were like, I mean, all they can say is no, especially once they offer you the position, if they want you. If you don't ask, you'll never know. And I would also say for all the listeners that if you are going to any type of public institution, you can look up everyone's salary. That's all publicly accessible information. And that was something that I did to give me a sense of what are the ranges for the people that are employed within the center. So I had an idea of what their budget is, to figure out, do I ask for the 15% or do I ask for the 20 to 25%?
Yeah, that's a great advantage when you're going to those types of places that you can there's complete transparency or a large degree of transparency around salary there. So yeah, that's an amazing thing to look up if that's where you're applying. So last question here, Fushcia, as we wrap up, what is your best financial advice for another early career PhD? And that could be something that we have touched on in this interview, or it could be something completely else.
So I think my first piece of advice would be to do as much research as you can. As grad students, we're training basically how to do research and conduct research. And so I think we already have a lot of the skills to be able to access these resources and information, and find ways or people to help us get there. And I would say that most of the way that I have navigated my finances has been through talking to friends, talking to people who are, in positions where I see myself going, and just doing the research and using, the academic online journals that are available, or financial journals, blogs, anything and everything that you can capture to try and help inform what the decision that will be best for you, or rather the best decision for you. The second thing that I would say is to give yourself more value and credit than what you would default to. So I think as, a graduate student, postdoc, there's this expectation that we just kind of have to accept things as they are. And, certainly in some cases, yes, that's true. But I think in a lot of cases, there are always things that are negotiable and that are malleable. And that I think a lot of that comes down to recognizing how valuable you are, not just as a person, but also as the work and your contributions. And that, the majority of the people in this country do not have PhDs. And so you're bringing in a very valuable skill set, which when you're going into a space where everybody has PhDs, it may not seem like that, but I think it's important to remind yourself of that. And I think especially, I say this to, women postdocs, like women of color, Black women postdocs, like we are already underestimated in many ways. We are already underpaid in many ways. Thinking about your initial salary offer or associated benefits. And so I think because of that, because of all the work that's coming out from the national academies and other research centers about this still huge discrepancy across all fields, I think I use that as a way to empower me to ask for more, right? Because now it's not just valuing my work and what I bring, but also recognizing that I'm already going to be undervalued, like because of what I look like when I come in the room. And so I think that would be the last piece of advice that I would say, for all the postdocs out there. And this includes, folks who are femme or femme identified. If you're any type of on the marginalized periphery, ask for more. Because again, all I can say is no. And if they take back that offer, then that's probably not a place you want to go in the first place, because you want to go where you're going to be celebrated and valued. So give yourself more value than what you default to.
I think you put that so well. That was great. I have nothing to add there. Just everybody go back and listen to that again. Listen to it a few more times, especially if you're in one of these groups that Fushcia just identified. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful interview. And it was really a pleasure to speak with you today.
Yes, thank you so much. This was really fun. And I hope that whoever's listening has been able to take something away, even if it's just to know that, you know, you're not the only one that's in grad school who's from a low income background or is having anxiety or fear around like debt or salary. Like that's normal. And also you will be okay. Everything will be fine.
Love that. Thank you so much, Fushcia.
Yes, thank you.
Listeners, thank you for joining me for this episode. pfforphds.com/podcast is the hub for the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast. There you can find links to all the episode show notes and a form to volunteer to be interviewed. I'd love for you to check it out and get more involved. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please consider joining my mailing list for my behind-the-scenes commentary about each episode. Register at pfforphds.com/subscribe. See you in the next episode, and remember, you don't have to have a PhD to succeed with personal finance, but it helps. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing and show notes creation by Lourdes Bobbio.